Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. Dr. Bailey has been supporting the Wyoming Department of Education and local educators for the last 5 years. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention and director of the Center of Multi-Tiered Systems of Support and the new Progress Center, promoting progress for students with disabilities at the American Institutes for Research. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone out there in virtual land. I've heard you've got some nice winds occurring across your state. And so hopefully you are being safe and we're able to bring in your umbrellas and all those other things that are getting blown around. So I am excited to be here and to talk about what I think is one of the most important topics, particularly under this new context of COVID. And it's really around how do we overcome what's happening of our poor quality tier 1 and do that through the implementation of high leverage practices. You may have heard something like high yield practices and also evidence-based practices, which are a little bit different than interventions that you might see at tier 2 and tier 3. I have a colleague here, Supriya Tamang, who will be on sort of responding in chat. And so as I introduce a couple of the resources, he will also put the link in the chat box. But as you see in the chat box right now, Dina Smith from the WDE has included a link to the resources, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a participant handout that I'll be referring to today. I highly recommend accessing those now because we're going to do a couple of activities that you'll get to do on your own and come back, but those resources will help make it a much more engaging experience. I wanted to share what the outcomes are today, so we're all on the same page. I want to make sure that there is a clear understanding about what is the differences and similarities among evidence-based practices, high leverage practices, and what we think about as tier 1 within an MTSS. I'm going to share some tools that can help you really identify and evaluate what you're using in your tier 1 system, whether it's your behavioral supports, your social and emotional supports, as well as your academic supports. And then I'm also going to talk about what are some key features of implementation that we need to consider as we're implementing those EBPs and HLPs within our tier 1. We have a pretty packed agenda, but it's designed to have some interaction in there. So be prepared to go do a Mentimeter activity or do some evaluation things on your own. There will be a break midway that's aligned with an activity so that you can get up and walk around. But feel free to stand up and do jumping jacks as long as your video is off. So I want to start out by saying life is really simple and we really insist on making it complicated. And this is really thinking about what we're doing in education right now. There's a lot of things that we're trying to manage. There are things we were trying to manage pre-COVID that when you add on the additional expectations and requirements of COVID, whether it's virtual learning or how to support kids with disabilities in a virtual session, it becomes much more complex. And so today's session, I'm going to really focus on the things that we really need to attend to in our tier 1 so we can reduce some of the complexity and increase the targeted focus on things that are going to really help us make some measurable gains. It's important to remember that when we think about tier 1, there's no single teacher who has all the time, the knowledge, the skills to meet the needs of every kid in their class. And it's important because when we sometimes think about tier 1, we often think about the overall success of a teacher, right? Oh, Miss So-and-so is so good, or Mr. So-and-so does some really amazing things. But when we think about an effective tier 1, it really is about collective efficacy. That there is no individual, whether they have been there for 30 years or they're a new teacher, who has all the degrees in the world, that they'll be able to support all of their students. So tier 1 is around how do we create that collective efficacy so we can have a collective belief that we can support all of our students and that we can really engage in activities that are likely to lead to sustainable impact. Now, collective efficacy is not just a fluffy terminology. It really has a very strong evidence base. And I want to clarify that collective efficacy is more than just the belief, right? It's the belief that I can make a difference, but it really is built upon this evidence of impact, right? So we all have to believe that we can help struggling learners or ELL kids or kids with disabilities or kids with low SES. That's the first step. Once we have that collective belief, then we implement the activities and strategies that are likely to produce those results. And then collective efficacy is the evidence, right, that we're making gains based on those beliefs, right? It's like a confirmation of it. And if you think about if you maybe did a New Year's resolution for working out or losing weight, initially you believe you can do it, right? And so it's hard, but you keep doing it, and then you start to see some results. And it's those results that empower you to do more things that lead to better results. So that evidence around this as a sort of practice or a way that we do business is really strong. So when we think about ES, and ES is called effect size, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later. It's this collective belief that can give us a 1.57 effect size. Now, if you're familiar with Hattie's work and you've heard me speak before, we think about a year's growth is equivalent to a 0.4 effect size. So if we can get a 1.57 effect size, imagine the sort of collective benefit that we have. Now, this is not including your interventions, right, at tier 2, tier 3. Those tier 2 and tier 3 also have their own effect, right? That's then added to this collective efficacy effect. So we have to really make sure that we're building a system that has this collective efficacy at tier 1. Now, what's great about this is that MTSS, when we think about tier 1, really provides us the data and the infrastructure to develop collective efficacy. Now, if you don't have MTSS in your system right now, or you've only got parts of it, that's okay. Because what we're going to talk about today are those tangible things that you can do at tier 1 to begin developing that collective efficacy at your core program level. And we'll know that we're having that collective benefit if we're seeing that at least 80% of our student population is benefiting from that alone, right? All students should be benefiting, but we know that the majority of students need to benefit from that by itself. And in order to really get the collective benefit of tier 1 for some kids, we will need tier 2 as well as tier 3, right? So it's that tier 1 collective efficacy has an effect. And some kids, in order to really get maximum effect, need additional supports at tier 2 and tier 3. So we want to make sure we have a really strong foundation. Now, this is true for kids with disabilities who are in our gifted and talented programs, or English language learners. So when we think about that collective efficacy at tier 1, we're not just looking at our total group of kids. We're looking at, is there collective efficacy for kids with disabilities, for kids who are in gifted and talented, for our English language learners, right? So 80% of those kids within the subgroup should also be benefiting. And that's because all of their special services are built upon this high quality tier 1 that we have in place. So if you really think about it, tier 1 is the most important levels of support. It's designed to meet the diverse needs of the greatest number of students, right? It gives us the biggest bang for our buck. It provides the greatest opportunity for collective efficacy and opportunity. I mean, if you think about like how we utilize our resources, this is where we can build that overall collective efficacy to meet the majority of kids. And it's also helping those kids who need additional supports too. So it's not that we're just helping a portion of them. But the other thing is that it provides the foundation for successful tier 2, tier 3, your enhancement services, your special education, right? So it's really where we need to start to focus our efforts. Now, when we think about focus, we sometimes see that ineffective tier one of the pitfalls that we fall into is as we're looking at our tier one, we start to ask the wrong questions. And as I present these today, I want you to think about, do we ask these questions and why are we asking these questions? But we find that in an ineffective tier one system or a system that less than 80% of kids benefit from alone, we start to see the questions that come up in team meetings or when we're reviewing data that really start to look at things like the individual, right? How do we get this kid to be better on the state test? Or which program should we purchase? Which intervention should we purchase? Which screening tool should we purchase? How do we meet the legal requirements? How do we get out of this cap or out of school improvement? And sometimes we even get to these questions that are, what's wrong with the kid? Or what's wrong with that teacher that they're not performing at the same level? Or what's wrong with that school? And what I'm going to really encourage you today is to think about how you can refocus your questions so that they are the right questions, that they're likely to get you to move towards collective efficacy. So if you step back and you say, you know what, the first thing that we really need to think about is, what do we want for our kids? What do we want for our educators? And what do we want for our schools if you're working at the district level? And then we have to be honest about our current reality, right? Sometimes we want something and then we sit around and we say, gosh, if we just had, or man, we can't do that because we're sort of missing the boat. So instead, we think about what we want for our kids. We take an honest look at our current reality. Some of us are impacted by COVID more, or we have community effects or parental participation that's really low. We can't use those as excuses in our tier one thinking. Instead, we have to say, this is what our current reality is. We want our kids here, this is where we are. And then we start to think about how do we move our kids that way to where we want them to be? What are the resources that we need? What are the supports? What are the guidance? And how can we put those in place? And then we can start to think about some of those questions we saw on the last slide, which is, which program should I use that's going to help my kids move from their current reality to where we need them to be? How can I support my teachers in this current context with my current resources? So that we're not really, we're building systems that are feasible in our current context, as well as likely to result in measurable gains. So I want to just get you to think really quickly, and you don't have to tell anybody, but think to yourself, are your school teams really asking the right question? When COVID hit, the #1 question that we received across our national centers was, which programs can I use in a virtual setting, right? They didn't really think about what were the needs of the kids, what was the current context. It's more about what can we get to fix it? And as a result, we're not able to focus on emerging needs, social, emotional, behavior, access. So we have to step back at this point, even now, and say, what is it that we want for our kids? What is our current reality? How do we, what do our kids and teachers and schools need to be successful? And how do we leverage our existing resources to get them what they need? So we're gonna do a quick chatter fall. So this idea of collective efficacy is really what today we're gonna talk about. It's what we're trying to achieve at Tier 1. But sometimes we have some indicators happening in our system that make it clear that maybe we don't have collective efficacy, right? And so on the screen, you'll see 6 of the most common indicators that there's something happening with Tier 1 that's not leading to that collective efficacy or that benefit. So the first one is less than 70 to 80% of kids are identified as at or above target with Tier 1 alone. You've got inconsistent performance across your classrooms or grades. You know, you've got a stellar teacher and then you've got some others that are not producing same results. You see poor attendance or low engagement of your students or even low engagement of your teachers. You see high rates of students needing supplemental supports or interventions. You see benefits that are different across certain populations, right? So kids who have low socioeconomic status are not performing as well as those who have high socioeconomic status, or our ELL learners are not performing as well as our native English speakers, right? So that differential benefit. Or you may be seeing low teacher satisfaction or engagement. So I want you to think about how many of those are you seeing in your current context, right? And what I'm going to ask you to do is type it in the chat box, but don't push enter. So just put your number in the chat box. And then we're going to do what's called a chatterfall. And the chatterfall allows us to all share where we are at the same time. Okay, so it's kind of like if you were sitting in the face-to-face and I was like, raise your fingers to show me how many. So we're going to use a chatterfall approach to be able to share a collective on where we are on this. Okay, so on the count of 3, think about the number that you have, put it in the chat box, and I'm going to say enter. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, heck, you see a lot of high numbers coming in here. A lot of 5s, a lot of 4s. We do have some folks that have 1 or 2. Some folks have all of those things happening concurrently. So this is part of our going back to the right questions. It's really understanding our current reality. If we ignore the fact that we have low teacher satisfaction and engagement, and we buy the best program in the world, it's not really going to matter, right? If we have low attendance, then whatever we do that's great in our tier 1 is not going to result in the benefit. So part of our first step is really understanding our current reality so that we can start to think about what are the needs within our tier 1 that need to be addressed for us to get that maximum benefit. Now, I just want to share really quickly, and you probably already know this, that there is no way that we can buy ourselves out of a poor quality tier 1. I've been in the field of education for over 25 years. I think there's always been this desire for the magic bullet that if we just had this programmer, if we just had this teacher or this behavior plan in our place, that things would be better. And as we've talked about with education, it's much more complex than that. So we have to really be thinking about where do we want to be, where are we right now, and what do our kids need and our students need to get there. Sometimes it will be a purchase program, but it will never be a purchase program by itself. That will be part of the package that we may be considering. So throughout this session, as Tom mentioned, there's this opportunity to ask questions or make comments, and you can put those in the chat box at any time. Those will be anonymous. They go to Tom, and then Tom will stop me, and then we'll answer, or I'll answer those questions. So as we go through the presentation today, if there's just something that doesn't make sense or you have a reaction to, please share it. And then we'll have a couple of opportunities for engagement throughout the session today for us to really take a look at those and maybe see how we can either address them if there's something we can address, or think about next steps. And Tom, I'm seeing none now, so I will keep going. All right, so today, and as we've probably already done, there are a lot of words, right? Remember I said life is simple, but we insist on making it complicated. One of the things that we do in education is we love different words. And sometimes from an educator standpoint, you look at the words and you're like, are they the same? Are they different? Is she talking about another program? So I want to just sort of make sure that we are on the same page about some terminology that you already may be using in your system that's either similar or very similar to what I'll talk about today. So one of the main terms I'm going to use, primarily because it's in the title, is evidence-based practices. And when we talk about evidence-based practices, these are those practices that have been shown through evidence to have some support. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. You may also hear people say things like research-based practices or evidence-based programs. So those are kind of the same thing, but what I want to clarify today is these don't necessarily correlate with a purchased intervention or a purchased program. And instead, these would be the things that teachers do within a program that's defined or designed that are likely to lead to benefit. And it's the combination of multiple practices, right, that often get us to the benefit that we're trying to get to. The other thing I'm going to use today is called high leverage practices. And depending on the professional learning that you've received, you may also hear things like high yield practices or instructional practices or evidence-based instructional practices. Those are all sort of the same in the way that I'm going to talk about it today, but these high leverage practices are actually a set of practices that have been compiled over the last several years through educators and research that are defining those evidence-based practices or policy-based practices that are likely to produce the highest results. So those are the two terms I am going to be using today. If you have a different term that you're using and you're not really clear where it fits, just put it in the chat box. But I just wanted to make clear before we get too far into it. Now, when we think about Tier 1, we think about it not just in terms of an academic. We think about social, emotional, behavioral, any of those sort of broader needs that a kid might have falls under your Tier 1. And so when we think about Tier 1, right, it's really that base of what we're doing for all students, whether you're using MTSS or using some other model. But it's, in essence, it's everything that you do for the kid that's not intervention, right? So it's the curriculum that you provide, the instructional strategies that you provide, and it really focuses on the entire class. Even though you might be doing some small breakout groups, that's fine. There's often some set of assessment that is related just to Tier 1, and we often think about an MTSS as a screening assessment, but it's also where your accountability assessments or benchmark tests may also fall. But I think what's most important is that it is all students, whether they have a label or not, all students should be thought about when you're designing and implementing Tier 1. So what really is it? In a sense, it's the foundation of an MTSS system or a school system. Before we even thought about MTSS, it's just what we did for all kids. And we think about it from an educational design as what we do to meet the diverse needs of all learners, not necessarily to meet the needs of diverse learners, that's also part of it, but it assumes that every kid has diverse needs, right? I have a kid who's good in math, but not so good in reading. He likes PE, but he hates art, right? So we think about what we do for all kids, assuming all kids have diverse needs. It includes really the what and how of what we do, right? So it's the curriculum, the materials, the programs, whatnot, but it's also how we use those materials to really support students. And a good way to think about Tier 1 is that it includes everything that's not intervention, because intervention by definition is supplemental. So when you think about Tier 1, every piece within your Tier 1 has an effect. Your schedule, the standards that you have, the way your teachers are trained, the technology and resources, that's part of your Tier 1. And one of the pitfalls that has really, I think, consumed us over the last decade is sometimes people think, I just need a new curriculum, right? And if we just change the curriculum, everything would be okay. And what we need to do is step back and say, I need to look at the overall system. So why does it matter that we know what Tier 1 is? And it's because the greatest threat to what we do in a school, whether it's a multi-tiered system of support or general school success, the greatest threat to that is poor quality Tier 1. Because what it ends up doing is it increases the number of students who need supplemental intervention, meaning they need more than what I'm providing in tier 1, which requires more resources, more staffing, more teachers, more time. We don't really have that. But it also decreases the impact of our core instruction as well as our intervention instruction, because we only have a certain level of capacity to support students. Even if we brought in a gazillion teachers, kids still only have so much time in their day. So what we start to see is as we have poor quality tier 1, it increases the number of kids who need additional support, which then decreases the overall impact of our tier 1 and our intervention support. And as you saw before, when you think about all of those needs that you have, tier 1 concerns are not just about academics. We often use academics as an indicator. The state test looks poor, our benchmarks look poor, but these other things really are indications of where we maybe need to beef up our tier 1, like low teacher satisfaction. We've got to do some work with our teachers. We see differential benefits across different groups. We need to make sure that we're attending to cultural and linguistic responsiveness of our materials, that there's equity within the distribution of our programs. So I want to stop right here and then give you all an opportunity to really reflect. And I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to think about your current collective efficacy in your tier 1, right? And all of you in there, no one said 0, so you at least have one indicator of a poor tier 1 issue. Is think about, why is it that your data are looking that way, right? Like, why do we have more than 20% of kids in intervention? Why are my teachers not satisfied with what's happening? So in the chat box, you'll see a link that goes to our word cloud activity. If you're feeling really frisky, you can use your camera. You just open your camera and point it at the QR code and it will take you right to the activity. Or you can always type it into mentimeter.com and use the code that you see right here. And as you type in your words, what you're going to see is a word cloud. And that's, once the word cloud gets populated, then I will share that with the overall group. Okay, so I'll give you about 2 minutes. Seeing some words coming up. Yes. And for those of you who are able to see the screen or the word cloud in real time, you'll see that some of the words are darker than others. And those are the words that are more frequently mentioned by those completing this, right? So you can see time is right in that center. It's really bold and it's big. It means a lot more participants are writing in that term than other terms. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds. Yeah, see a lot of complacency, stuck in a rut, burnout. So that's that last indicator that we talked about, is that teacher satisfaction or engagement. And this context right now is increasing the stress and expectations on teachers. So we have to really be mindful of that as we think about the design of our tier 1 as well as the implementation of our tier 1. Great, so thank y'all very much for participating. So you can see that time and consistency And then burnout, of course, coming in as some of our top reasons that we might be seeing some challenges in Tier 1. And I will share it again if you want to keep putting stuff. I see a little bit of things still happening. So if you look at what we see, and I'll show it to you here in a second, you'll notice that a lot of the things that you put into this barriers or things getting in our way of collective efficacy really fall around two main buckets. The first one is design, right? Are we designing a system that can be feasibly implemented and likely to produce the gains that we want? Sometimes we have high hopes for something, but we just don't have the time and capacity to implement it, right? And so we have to really look at where is the breakdown in our Tier 1. The other one is delivery, right? We had a good design, it looked great on paper, but it just didn't really make it in. We didn't have enough teachers were burnt out, as you mentioned. We don't have a lot of consistency coming across our sites. And so I'm going to ask you as we go through this next section to start to think about where are, and this is what you all mentioned before, are some of the bigger challenges that we have. Do they fall more under the design issue, or do they fall more under our delivery? Because the more narrow we can get in trying to identify some of the challenges in our Tier 1, the more likely we are to prevent some of those pitfalls or address some of the pitfalls that we may have already fallen into. Sorry, I have way too many windows here. So we're not going to do this activity, but it is something to think about, and we'll do, I'll share all these again at the end, is thinking about what do we do, right? If you're thinking about it right now and you're like, oh my heck, I think we have a lot of issues with our Tier 1. One of the first steps that we recommend taking is really to understand what's happening in your Tier 1. There are two resources. One will be in the chat box, and it's available from the Wyoming Department of Ed through their Wyoming Instructional Network. And it's a checklist, and there's one for academics and there's one for behavior. And that really is all of the sort of pieces of MTSS. But in terms of Tier 1, we've in your handout packet on the first page, our first two pages, you will see a breakdown that really gets you to think about how are we looking at our own Tier 1 from this collective efficacy standpoint. So I want to just share, I've talked about that high leverage practice and I talked about those EVPs, and we're going to talk about these both from a design standpoint. Did we actually select the right ones? And then did we implement them the way that we were supposed to implement them? There's been a lot of conversation around high leverage practices, and that's because there's a lot of evidence coming out that if we attend to high leverage practices and we can increase the consistency in which teachers across a grade level, across a school, across a district are using high leverage practices, we see greater gains for students, all students, not just particular students. And when we think about high leverage practices, these really are those fundamental practices for supporting student learning. It's what makes us a teacher compared to someone who's not a teacher, right? It's the craft of our field. And McCleskey and Brownell really described it as this, it's how we deliver instruction. And I say that because if you think about that teachers are disengaged or low satisfaction, one of the things and how we deliver is enthusiasm, right? And teachers who are seen as enthusiastic by their students have greater engagement from their students, right? So a high leverage practice is really about how we present ourselves and the materials that also leads to this increased engagement by students. Now, when we think about HLPs at Tier 1, they're pretty much fundamental, not just to Tier 1, but also fundamental to just teaching itself. So you'll see them in Tier 2, Tier 3, if you're a speech and language pathologist, or if you're a principal, you'll see that these practices sort of go across the overall tiers or parts of education. And they also cut across different domains and grade levels. So there's academics and behavior and math and reading and writing. So it's not unique to a particular content area, nor is it unique to whether you're in preschool or secondary. And so this is what's nice about it from a tier 1 standpoint, is it's the practices that give you the biggest bang for your buck. The other thing is they're used very frequently, because as a teacher, my craft are these high leverage practices. And I want to be very intentional about them because they've been supported by research and in some few cases around policy. Now, in your handout packet, you will see a list of the first high leverage practices. And those are from Teaching Works. They're considered to be the general practices that all teachers need to know and do for us to get collective benefit. There are 19 practices. So in your handout packet, you will see them broken down into an assessment tool. And we're going to play around with the assessment tool really quickly. But I want you to know that there's also another set of practices. Now, it doesn't mean that you use one or the other. The high leverage practices in special education are those that are meant to be more intense than the ones that we would be doing in general education. And as I mentioned, right, kids with disabilities or kids in gifted programs or an ELL need the collective benefit from tier 1. So they benefit from their general education teachers using high leverage practices in tier 1. And then those students who may be receiving more intensive supports get more intensive access to high leverage practices. So it's not one or the other, it's that one is building upon the other to create a greater intensity for your intervention. So I'm going to give you a second, but in your handout packet that you'll see the link to from Deanna, is that what we're looking for is that how well are these done across our school? So in our tier 1 word cloud, somebody mentioned consistency is a major issue in our tier 1. And inconsistency in tier 1 practices, high leverage practices, can be a major threat. You can have the best program in the world, but if we don't deliver it in a consistent way using high leverage practices, we lose that benefit. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is pull it out, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to take a gander at just the first one. So I don't want you to look at the rest. I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. But right now, what I want you to do is read the description for that very first high leverage practice that's there. And I put it a little bit bigger on the screen in case you can't access your handouts. But it really is the high leverage practice of leading a group discussion. It's much more specific than just this general concept. So take a look at that. So as you read that, it's a very clear sort of description of what that practice is. Sometimes we make assumptions, which I often call assume-aside. It's a threat to education in general. But we make assumptions that every teacher knows how to lead a group discussion. It is a certain skill. Some of us are better than others. And we know that when teachers have a collective sort of skill level in leading group discussions, we see a benefit, right, to student outcomes. Now, it's not just that one, it's the adding all of them, but it is a specific skill. So I want you to just really think about your current reality, right, across the teachers that you see within your school, and to what extent are they really implementing high quality, skill in leading a group discussion. So we're going to do the chatter fall again. So right now is thinking about, I have no idea if other teachers are doing that. I assume, but I don't know. If you assume they're doing it, then mark it as a 0. I only want you to mark 1 or 2 if you have evidence that there is consistency in leading a group discussion across your school or your class or your district, okay? If you think it's some teachers have that skill, then you're going to put a 1. But if you think most teachers, like maybe you've had some PD around this, or you all have really talked about this in your PLCs, then this is where we might put a 2. Okay. So type in your number for that first high leverage practice, and then on the count of 3, I want you to click enter. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so if folks take a look at what you're seeing in the chat box, what you notice is that there's either very few of you who've seen this in practice, or maybe very few, but you probably think some teachers are, you being one of them, and maybe some of the colleagues that you've observed, but you don't really know if that's happening. This is one of the things that we make assumptions that everybody within our system has the same skill, commitment, knowledge to do the practice, right? And that may not necessarily be the case. So one good way to think about where do we go next is to really have a good understanding of the inconsistencies that exist within our system. Because if we're not sure if we have good quality skills in leading a group discussion, we can do some very targeted PD to increase that overall skill and knowledge, which would increase the overall access for students to the curriculum that's being provided. So just real quickly, we'll do the next one, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of time to take a gander at all of them, because I'm sure you're pretty interested. But the next one has a very large effect size in and of itself as a practice. And we often refer to it as explicit instruction, but here it's defined much more broadly. It's explaining and modeling content, practices, or strategies, right? So there's a skill to that. It's not just the program we purchase, but it's what the teacher does that gets that curriculum into the hands or into the heads of the kids that we're working with. So take a moment to read this one as well and think again about your current context and what's happening. And then we'll do another chatterfall, and then I'll let you take a couple of minutes on your own to peruse through all the other 19 practices. Well, I can see people, my overachievers, putting in a lot of ones. Yeah. Yeah, so when we think about where do we start to improve Tier 1, focusing on high leverage practices is a really good first start, partly because they're very clearly defined practices that we could tease out and do within, like a staff meeting or when our peer coaching, or if you have a coach in your school, to really build up our use of a particular practice that's likely to produce results. Now, a good first step, though, is to really understand the overall context of what's happening in your school. Because if you find that we are a 1 on every single practice, then that's where it becomes overwhelming, right? Is that we have some teachers who do it and some don't. And just to give you a little reason why this inconsistency matters, is you could have a kid who has the best teacher in the world one year, and that kid makes amazing gains on their state test. But the research shows that if a teacher doesn't have that same high quality teacher or instruction 3 years in a row, then they will lose any benefit from that first teacher, right? So that's the collective benefit. It's not a one-off that leads to student gains. It's the consistency in high quality instruction over multiple grades or multiple teachers that really leads to the sort of sustainable gains. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to just give you a little bit of time. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. So if you also need to stand up and move around, you can do that. But I want to give you an opportunity to take a look at the other practices. The link to the chat or to the handouts that has those is in the chat box. But Supriya also put the main website, which is the Teaching Works, and where you can actually find them on the website. And if you find that this is an area that you feel like this is a good way to increase our collective efficacy, that Teaching Works website, as well as the highleveragepractices.org, has training videos, training materials that are asynchronous, right, of no cost to you, to really do some local professional learning. Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes and then we'll come back. And if you have questions, this would be a good time to put those in there. And when we come back, then Tom can share those out. So as you're coming back, feel free to share some of your thoughts in the chat. If you want to share with everyone, then just make sure you do all panelists and attendees. I can see that sometimes people, when you respond in the chat, it's coming just to the panelists, so your peers can't see that, which is fine. But if you have any comments or questions, or if you have a specific question, then you can send that through the questions box. Okay. Well, once you have a good understanding of high leverage practices, then the evidence-based practices make a lot more sense. Because the evidence-based practices, and that's what we'll talk about now, really have to do with the what, right? We have to deliver something with those high leverage practices. And so part of what we're looking at is not really the program, right, or the curriculum that we purchase. It really is about the evidence-based practices that make up the program that we've designed or purchased. So we think about HLPs as delivering EBPs, or evidence-based practices. And the things that distinguish it have to do with when you use it, right? High leverage practices is all kids across all grade levels. When we get to high evidence-based practices, it's for a specific content area. This is a practice for reading for kids who are in kindergarten who have disabilities, right? So the practices become very narrow, and the practice itself has been evidence-based within a particular subject, grade level, student learner population. And this is probably what you're most familiar with. And we sometimes equate these practices to interventions, but in reality, an intervention that you might use at tier 2, tier 3 takes several evidence-based practices and puts them together as a package and then validates that package of practices, right? And that's the same thing you have at core program level. Now at tier 1, most of the things that we purchase or use at tier 1, if they are a published program, have not really been rigorously evaluated. And instead, each of the practices in the program is likely to have some evidence, but the collection of them in, let's say, your core reading program may not have gone through the same level of rigor as an intervention. Now, we know that because there are a lot of tools that are available for us to use. And a little bit later, I'm going to send you off and running so that you can play around with these. But I do want to share some of them, because it helps us understand if the evidence-based practices that we're using in tier 1 really are the right practices. Now, there are 3 main approaches to evaluating your core programming. You have a handout in your participant packet that lists all of these, plus the 2 that you just saw for high leverage practices. But if you want to take a gander, I'll demonstrate it here, but a little bit later, I'm going to let you get on some of these websites and find them. But the thing about What Works Clearinghouse, and the reason it was developed in the first place, is because it was designed to help us not only identify evidence-based programs that we might use at tier 1, but also to really understand the practices that have an evidence base, so that when we go to look at a program, we can say, yes, this program has all the things that it needs to have, even if the overall program has not been researched. Down here at the bottom, you will see practice guides, and we're going to play around with those a little bit later. But up here, what you'll see is that there are evidence-based practices and interventions and programs for different content areas. So if you're interested, for example, in literacy, you could just click on literacy, and you will see a number of programs that exist by different grade levels. Now, you're probably interested in saying, well, is it a core program, or does it work for ELL kids? There is a More Filters button that is available. And so if you click on that More Filters button, what it allows you to do is narrow down. So if you're looking for a curriculum that's across multiple grades, you don't have to select that, right? You want something for your elementary school. But what you can also do is look at different things. I want general education. I want to make sure that it's available for whole class. And I want to make sure that it is at the curriculum level. And so what you'll see is that it will narrow down to give you a sense about what's been validated for that particular criteria. So in this case, we could look at a tier 1 program where people would say, oh, well, Read 180 and Success for All have been evaluated. Now, we talked about effect sizes earlier, and effect sizes are important because remember, we're looking for collective efficacy. And we want to know how much collective efficacy can we expect from a program, right? We can look at it by practice, or we can combine a bunch of practices, like in this case, to come up with a program. And so each of these, if you click on them, will have some evidence about the grade levels and the overall effects. And then there is an intervention report that you can use. Now, some of you might say, well, isn't Read 180 an intervention? Well, the thing is it's also sold as a tier 1 supplement. So that's why you might see it come up in your, as you do some evaluation. The other program I'll share, and it's also in the chat box, is Evidence for ESSA. And this is where if you're looking at things like attendance, you're finding that attendance is a significant issue, you can go into the attendance and look at what are some of those practices that are available to help us increase the overall collective efficacy within our school by increasing attendance, right? So there are a lot of programs, and then when you click on them, what you'll see is that they have been rated for different criteria, just like the What Works Clearinghouse, but they've been rated against the ESSA standards. So it can give you a little bit more confidence in why you might be using something at your tier 1 level. You'll also see that it's studied by groups. You can get information about grade level, and then really getting an understanding of what the program is. The other program that is available or resource that's available is Best Evidence Encyclopedia. And I'm not going to demonstrate it right now, but it's something to consider checking out. But it also looks at core reading, math, and behavioral programs. Now, I mentioned the practice guides, and we'll come back to these a little bit later, but the What Works Clearinghouse, one of its main things that it promotes is the use of practice guides, and it's outlining the evidence-based practices that make up what should be a high-quality core program, or in some cases, an intervention. And they're divided by, just like we talked about with the practices, by content level, grade level, and learner, right? So in this case, we have adolescents, grade level, and then the content area is literacy. And in this case, they're talking about students as a whole. And what they'll say from the research and expert feedback is that there are practices, right? Evidence-based practices that you would expect to see in a high quality program, right? So you could design your own as long as they include these practices, or you could purchase one as long as they include these core practices. Now, the biggest thing is the relationship between HLPs and EBPs. It's not one or the other. It's really like a package that if I really want collective efficacy, I have to assume that my teachers have a core-based knowledge of high leverage practices, right? That they can consistently use those in my pre-K program, my secondary program, my special education program, and that they're using them across all of the evidence-based practices that we are providing to our students. And it's that sort of alignment and comprehensiveness that really gives us the collective efficacy. So we've talked about this idea of design and delivery, and I asked you to think earlier around the concerns that you see are greatest for you. And so we're going to do a quick poll. It's kind of a one or the other, so it should be a quick Mentimeter activity. But if you look in the chat box, you will see that there is a link to it. If you're feeling really frisky, you can use your camera to access the QR code that's there. But what I'd like you to do is select which of these do you feel is the biggest challenge that you have right now in terms of collective efficacy? We did the broader word cloud, but now we're going to narrow it down and say, is it a design issue or is it really an implementation issue? Getting a lot of feedback on one and not the other. See, Michael always had delivery in the chat box. We do have a lot of folks completing the survey, so if you can get in there and just click which one you think is your biggest barrier to collective efficacy. And so I'll share this as we're still working on it. So Fidelity and engagement, right, is a big piece of our implementation, but you will see, hold on, I just lost my, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So you'll see that a lot of folks are saying it really is around that delivery piece, right? That, you know, we feel like we've got all the right bells and whistles. We know what maybe a high leverage practice is. We have a good schedule. We have a good program, but we're not really using it in a way that's getting to our collective benefit. And if somebody, you know, just put in a couple of, just a word or two, and you can send it just to the panelists, is what is it that you're seeing around the delivery of tier 1 is specifically the most challenging? Is that it's just not getting delivered? Or is it an attendance issue? Or is it really the inconsistency of it? Yeah, Kelsey mentioned the consistency. Yeah, and I think that consistency is really our major challenge. A couple of people have noted that, and it's not an easy fix, but it's something that we can put our sort of minds around and say, you know what, we know what we're doing is the right thing to do, but what we need to do is clean it up. And we sometimes have to find out why our inconsistency exists. Is it because we have way too much going on and we need to pare down? Is it because teachers don't have the training necessary to be consistent? We're not giving them enough time. Dawn mentioned, you know, losing staff, where you get started and you probably lose somebody and then you have to start back over. So there's not a quick fix on what is consistent or how do we address that inconsistency, but we want to make sure that we understand the nature of the inconsistency. All right, so what we're going to talk about are just some tools to help you think about, is there a way for us to be thinking around the selection and the implementation of it? Because sometimes, remember, we select things that look great on paper, but they're not really feasible in our system, which often leads us to have inconsistent implementation. Now, as we looked at the inconsistency with the HLPs, what you probably found is that a lot of your teachers and implementation falls in a 1. And so it becomes overwhelming. We're like, oh my gosh, we're inconsistent on everything. What should we do? So there are some recommendations about where to start in terms of increasing your overall consistency on those high leverage practices that have the greatest effect. So if you look at this slide right here, what you see is there are 5 practices that fall under high leverage practice that also really highly aligned with a lot of evidence-based practices. The first one, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, is making sure that you're setting very clear long-term and short-term goals for your students, that kids know where they're going. It's really what Patty got to with visible learning. Implementing organizational routines or instructional routines we found this to be highly impactful in a virtual setting, is that sometimes we went from a face-to-face where we had really good classroom routines that did not translate to a virtual or hybrid setting. So then we have to reteach new routines to ensure that the student is able to access what we're talking about. And that's over class routines, but there's also instructional routines. So we're presenting content in a similar way with similar words across classrooms and across grade levels. You'll notice this number 3 seems really different. Like, we often think about the instructional practices, but the high leverage practice of building relationships with students has a significant impact on student learning. Is that even if you're not the best at what you do, if you're fully committed and you care about your kids, what we find is that kids are much more engaged in the learning. They want to attend, they want to work with you because they like being with you. The relationship with the teacher is seen as valuable. When we have poor relationships between peers and teachers, it doesn't really matter if you have the best curriculum, all the best interventions. It's because the kid is not likely to be engaged in the learning in the first place or attend, right? And if you're seeing kids with a lot of poor attendance, it could be that there is a mismatch between the relationship that we think there exists and that there really exists. The other thing is around providing oral and written feedback. There's been a lot of work with this during COVID around how to increase parents' quality feedback to their child so that they can really maximize the learning in a virtual environment. But for teachers, when teachers give high quality feedback to students, we see very large effects, right? We talked about that 0.4 being equivalent to 2 years growth. We're seeing 0.7. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And it doesn't really require us to buy anything. It just requires us to be very intentional about our feedback and consistent within our classroom and across classrooms. And then finally, this last one of explaining and modeling content. And that's the second one that we looked at in our activity. It's just that we have to be very explicit in the way that we're teaching new skills. And within a virtual setting, if you are doing virtual learning, we know that it's even more important because the kid's cognitive capacity is reduced in a virtual setting. And so we don't have a lot of time to weed through the sort of fluff that's there. We've got to be very targeted and clear in what we provide. There are a couple high leverage practices that don't really have the same evidence base that fall under policy, for example, that sort of relate to the building respectful relationships. And so something else to think about is learning about their cultural, linguistic, intellectual, and personal experiences so that you can match your instruction. We've put some resources in the handout. So like we looked at that number 2 on your high leverage practices. There are a ton of resources like this. But to evaluate what it is that we're doing well within that practice and where do we need to increase our overall consistency, there are checklists like the one that you see here, and it's in your participant handbook. And it really gets us as a teacher team. We all will likely say, yes, explicit instruction is important, and most of us will say, yes, we do it. But until we really sit down and explain to each other what I think is high leverage practice of explicit instruction and what you think is explicit instruction, then we may be assuming that the other person has the same thinking as us. So we're both doing what we think is right, but it doesn't mean we're doing the same thing at the same level of intensity. So these types of resources allow you to bring your team together to really understand the discrepancies in our knowledge and skills, and then come to some collective as a team around what we're going to focus on. So I'll put my disclaimer out there, particularly at Tier 1, there's no evidence-based practice that works for every student in every situation. And oh my heck, COVID right now has put in a situation in which there's even less research, right, that's available for how things work. And so it really depends on us thinking and knowing our current context and our students and where we want our kids to be. And I put this resource in your handout to get you to say, to give yourself some wiggle room, right? That there's no specific thing that you have to do, but there are some things that we need to consider. when we're selecting the practices that we want to maintain consistency to. One is it feasible, right? We do a lot of cool stuff, but sometimes some teachers are really good at it and other teachers struggle. Virtual instruction was one of those, right? Some teachers found it really easy to do. Some teachers just said, this is well beyond my skill set and it's too stressful. So we're not going to get the consistency that we want. So when we look at that feasibility, we look at feasibility to deliver, the training necessary to do it, the complexity in which we do it, and the time that it takes. And then we make a decision about, is this a feasible intervention or program? Then we look at acceptability. And this is something we don't always engage teachers in, but we really need to, is to say, is this a tier 1 program or practice that's acceptable to you? Are you willing to buy in and engage in this consistent implementation with all of us? And this is where assume-aside comes into play. We often assume everybody is in it for the same reason, and we really need to engage individual folks to understand if this is acceptable, and if not, what needs to change or how can we make it more acceptable. The other thing is we want to look at impact, and that's where the evidence base comes into play. Those websites you're about to play on in a little bit, is that we really have to understand that what we're doing is going to produce results. We can have things that are feasible and acceptable that have no expected impact. And that's a concern, right? And so we want to make sure that it's not only feasible and acceptable, but it's likely to produce results. And the last one here is that it's relevant, that the research that you're looking at when you go to, we're about to get on the What Works Clearinghouse website, that you're looking at, is this research similar to my population, right? Is the impact not just for kids in urban school district in Chicago, are they relevant to my kids in my rural school with these types of needs? So the practice guides can help you do that. And so here in a second, I'm going to give you some time to play around in the practice guides. And in order to sort of navigate those, we have included a handout in the participant package. And remember, when we think about those evidence-based practices that we're looking at in the practice guides, they are unique to a subject. And so you'll see a bunch of different practice guides for different areas: writing, reading, math, behavior, post-secondary education, graduation. And so we want to make sure that we're picking something, as I mentioned on the last slide, is relevant. And so when you look at it, you can scroll through them, match what looks like your population, and then you can open it up. And so Lindsay, there is a link that we'll put in as well. And then I'm going to let Tom chime in here for a second.
I just had a question here I was going to read to you, Tessie. It just asked if you have that one teacher, it's just not acceptable no matter what, how do you get them to buy in?
You know, this has been a challenge. I say I'm a recovering teacher because it was where I spent the most dedication of my life. But I remember very explicitly having a teacher that, despite me showing, and I was a support teacher, and then I was a general ed teacher, but we shared our screening data every quarter. And I remember it would show, you know, we were doing well, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then grade 4 was here, and then grade 5, grade 6. And it was just one teacher. And we would show the data and we would talk about it. But it took that teacher 3 years before she finally said to me, oh my gosh, do you see that my data is not similar, right? And we often talk about the readiness of a teacher to hear something. And sometimes teachers are not ready, and we have to really differentiate the supports, just like we do for kids, for teachers as well. Some of them have invested their entire life in this, particularly teachers who've been in the field for a long time. And it's really hard to recognize that maybe what you're doing is not producing results. So just like what we would see in other fields, there's sometimes a bit of denial. There's sometimes a bit of excuse making. And so we have to go through that process. But the thing that we have really sort of honed in on is that if we have persistent, consistent communication with that teacher and supporting that teacher, we can make that transition in their belief feasible and happen. But it's not easy. I will also say that there are some people who will never change. And that's not unique to education. And we have to take that into account in our current reality, right? And that's unfair. And that's where leadership needs to step in to really sort of work with that teacher and make a plan for re-engaging them in the sort of collective efficacy. So I wish I could say, do this or this, but it's often a very person-dependent issue, kind of like attendance is for kids. You know, why they don't attend is very different among each kid. Hopefully that answered. If not, just tell Tom and then I can address it better. So, okay. Yeah, Maria, I think that persistent, consistent, and I will tell you something too, is sometimes they just need to hear it from somebody else. I mean, you're never a promise in your own land. Somebody else comes in and says exactly what you have said from a different perspective, and they're like, oh, I get that, and then they're ready. So I think also leveraging some of your peer supports that are in other districts or even at the State Department can sometimes help you navigate those conversations. So as we move into giving you an opportunity to look at the practice guides for Tier 1 and what's available, I just want to point out a couple of things. Each practice guides includes a set of practices that are unique to a domain and a grade level, and sometimes a learner. So you want to attend to this. Like this one says early elementary. So if you're high school, it's probably not the best one to look at, but it'll say literacy. And then within the guide, there will be a set of practices, and there is a sheet for each practice. There's a practice guide, like how to implement that practice, how to evaluate it, how to address roadblocks. It's pretty cool. But then you'll look at the level of evidence. And something that's confusing for people is that it'll say minimal here. And sometimes people interpret that as, oh, well, there's no evidence for that. It's not that there's no evidence. It's that unlike, let's say, this practice 2, which has strong evidence, the strong means there are multiple studies across the country that really have evidence for that. Where minimal, it might be one study in one state, right? So there's evidence that's an evidence-based practice, but the amount of evidence that we have is not as strong as, say, another practice. So keep that in mind. You will see that, for example, in the math instructional practices, where you have some that are strong and minimal. The assumption is preparing problems and using them whole class instruction is an evidence-based practice for Tier 1 math in 4th through 8th grade. The other thing is, as you're navigating the site to really look at the practices, is there are resources that go along with those. So if you've identified that, wow, we really need to beef up the implementation of our practices, there are some guides in here in how to make them more efficient and more effective. And so there's some videos, there's individual guides, there's checklists for like, if you come across a roadblock or something else, and that's a good way to engage your team. Like what we're just talking about is you have that sort of reluctant teacher. These are a good way, so it's not me telling you, right? It's that we are all collectively going to look at this, and then the teacher can sort of have those aha moments on their own. And I think that's why the practice guides were developed, is to give us something to coalesce around in our PLCs or other PD. So what I'd like to do is just give you some time to really play around in the practice guides. And so what you're going to do, the link is in the chat box. And I want you, as you click on the link, is identify what's available for your practice, whether it's academics or behavior or writing. And then what I'd like you to do, I'm really encouraging active participation, is to share in the chat box what you found most beneficial or how that resource could help you as you move forward with improving your Tier 1, okay? So you're just gonna click on the link in the chat box, and then it'll take you directly to the page with the practice guides. And so I'm going to give you about 5 minutes again to sort of take a gander at what's there. You will see they're all listed here. You can search, but there's not a ton of them. So it's kind of okay to look through them. But as you get there, you can open them up and see what additional resources are available. Okay, so any questions before we get started? All right, so I'm going to give you 6 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back and we'd love to hear what you found as something new and cool or beneficial to your work. Thanks for sharing that, Shayla. I see the organizing instruction and study to improve student learning, and the ones about dropout. Yeah, those are great ones. There's not one for middle school behavior, and you all can't see her question. I will say that there are a number of them that are currently in the queue for development. It takes over a year to create a single practice guide. So they're pretty extensive. They go through a very specific approach to making sure that all of the research has been reviewed, and then it goes through a very long and intensive review process, like to actually get it out onto the website. I would say for behavior, Shayla, is maybe checking out the PBIS Center, and Supriya can put the link in the chat box, but that's a good place where they have really been identifying. That's one of OSEP's longest funded centers that is actually funded both from the general education side as well as the special education side. And they've really focused on what are the essential practices in that area. Good, Sonia, I'm glad those are helpful. And Anthea also mentioned the organizing instruction and study. So we have about a minute and a half. And for those of you who are looking at the adolescent literacy world, sorry, I just saw PBIS world from Tracy, but the improving adolescent literacy, that is the one that's likely to come out very soon. So that one has been updated. Yes, and Tracy shared in the chat box the pbisworld.com. It's also a useful resource. We have about 1 more minute and then we'll come back. Yeah, they're using a student achievement data. This comes from Shannon to support instructional decision making. Excellent. Good. So for those of you who didn't get around, some of the newer practice guides have a lot more supplemental support, which is why they're updating some of the older ones. As I mentioned, like the Adolescent literacy guide is currently being updated. I've seen a draft of that one. And the reason they're doing that is they want to make sure that those new practice guides or all of the practice guides have a lot of the supplemental resources that you probably saw, where you see that there are actual practice guides, like things to help teachers improve the consistency. So it's likely they're doing this practice, but what we sometimes see is there's inconsistency in understanding what the practice is and what it should look like. So the resources that are available include video as well as written practice guides so that you can really come to consensus about fidelity of implementation of that practice. And I see Kaylee mentioned, yeah, the reducing problem behavior in the classroom. Yeah, the behavior of 1 or 2 students can change and affect how the rest of the class learns completely. It's why my kid actually loves virtual learning, because he said he was in a really distracting class. And maybe it's just coming back from online learning and going through the events of the year, but those behaviors and where they stem from can really be helpful. Yeah, and I think, what we're seeing with the return to the classroom under this next administration, you're going to see a lot of focus on the return to classroom, is addressing the social and emotional learning needs that probably existed prior to COVID, but have really become much greater and apparent as a result of COVID. Great. Thank you all for sharing that. But I wanted to share those resources. And if you're ever looking for anything else, like you mentioned, I'm looking for one for, this behavior in middle school students, it doesn't exist, but that's something that if you let folks know that you're interested, then it ends up on a queue and then it will come up. May take a long time, but they will keep a focus on. So something I recommend is, this is a good activity. This is a smaller group here, but to go back with your team and really look through the practices and self-reflect and say, are we doing the core practices? And if we're doing the core practices and we're feeling overwhelmed, or we're doing more than the core practices and we're feeling overwhelmed, maybe this is our permission to let some things go, right? We have to make it feasible, right? Go back to that fair. We have to make what we're doing feasible within our classroom. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to maintain teacher engagement, which then will also start to lose our student engagement. And there are, like you mentioned, I didn't see my evidence-based practices that I need. There are some resources that have come out of the National Center on Intensive Intervention that are applicable here. There is just some questions to get us to think about when we are selecting or designing our own practice. Sometimes there are just areas in which we haven't done a lot of research for a number of reasons, and that's where our screening and progress monitoring with our group becomes so critical, because we then become our own researcher. And we saw this happen quite a bit under COVID, where we were doing things that really there was no evidence to do. And then we have to use our assessment data to really make confident decisions about, should I continue this practice? Do I need to tweak this practice? Or do we really need to expand this practice? And so going back to that handout that's in your book is just really thinking about this feasibility, acceptability, impact, and relevance. And this to me is a good time. Not a lot of positive stuff came out of COVID, but it has given us this opportunity to really reflect on what we're doing for all kids. And this is a good time for us to say, you know what? We've got some data and the impact and, this not being in place or this being in place. So let's really rethink the way that we develop our tier 1 so that we can really achieve collective efficacy. So I want to just finish up today really talking about Fidelity. All of this, as you'll notice, is about design and delivery, and you can't have one without the other. And sometimes we struggle with delivery because our design is poor, and it sort of manifests as inconsistency in our implementation, but really the root cause is we picked something that was not feasible. So we need to go back and look at our design. But sometimes it comes down to, we've got a great design and we just cannot get that thing into place. And when we think about Fidelity, it's really around, is the instruction being implemented, or the program or the practice being implemented as intended? And we've had some struggles in our field with the F word, and under No Child Left Behind, there was an over focus on Fidelity to the point that teachers felt like every single move that they were making was under the gun, to the point that no one was really paying attention to that. And what we need to get back to is a consistent understanding of Fidelity that as a collective in our site that we can agree to, right? So when we think about the high leverage practices, we have to think about Fidelity and what does it mean to have Fidelity? Well, we have to define the practice, and then we have to ensure that the practice is happening in the way that it was defined, right? We know that positive outcomes really depend upon the fidelity of implementation of the EBP and the HLPs that we've selected. So in other words, it's just the degree to which we're doing what we said we were going to do. And sometimes teachers deviate, and sometimes that is okay, right? Like we have 6 classes in our grade, and 5 of the teachers are doing it one way and the 6th teacher is doing it another way. And maybe that teacher is doing it a different way because the needs of the kids dictate that a different way is needed. When that happens, we really have to then say, well, did we select a program that was appropriate for the majority of our students? Or maybe that teacher has much more English language learners, and the core program we selected isn't really relevant for that particular population, right? So when we do adapt, it's okay, but we want to make sure that any adaptations we make are consistent across all teachers and across all grades so that we give every kid equitable access to the curriculum that we've selected. Now, in your handout or your handout packet, there is this handout right here, and it's the 5 elements of Fidelity. And the nice thing about this is it's applicable to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, special ed, gifted and talented, because it really looks at these general elements that we see. Too often we think about adherence as the main thing with Fidelity. And so teachers will say things like, I did that, right? I did lesson 14. I put my kids in small groups. I made sure they're reading this. But there are other pieces of Fidelity that really are more powerful in terms of overall impact. One of those is exposure. And some of you probably realized under your virtual delivery, kids didn't attend, right? Or maybe they sat on the Zoom session, but they played with their dog. And so while we may be adhering to the core program instruction, the kid is not being exposed to it at an appropriate level. And this is going to be a huge issue as we return to school and deal with a lot of kids with attendance, is that we can say that we did our part, but the kid was not part of that. And then that can't be the kid's fault, because what it means is we developed a program that was not accessible or engaging for the student. So I see Sonia's raised her hand, Tom. And I don't know if it's possible for Sonia.
I can turn on their mic. I just don't see where their hand is raised. Sorry.
Oh, she pressed the wrong button. That's okay.
Oh, okay.
That's okay, Sonia, if you want to talk, it's totally okay. Yeah. But yeah, so this exposure piece is a really big deal. And it's the same when you think about, we do 90 minutes of reading. Well, we could do a 90-minute reading block, but 15 of it is moving kids around. 15 of it is dealing with Billy's behavior. And then the instruction really only accounts to like 20% of that 90 minutes. So when we're thinking about exposure, it's the amount of exposure to the curriculum, the instruction that the kid is getting in the time that we've allotted. The quality of instruction really comes down to the consistency in which we're using HLPs to deliver that, right? And so we think about that as a level of fidelity. It's not that we did all the pieces, but the teacher is using those high leverage practices to adapt in real time, you know, differentiating or building the relationship with the student. They're not part of the program, but they're essential for the program to achieve its benefit. The other thing is about program specificity, and sometimes we create our own core programs, which is completely fine. But if we're not really explicit about what are the dimensions of that program or the components of that program, that's where we start to get inconsistency across teachers. Teachers believe they're doing what they need to do because we've designed a program that allows them a lot of flexibility. And while that flexibility might benefit some students and some teachers, it's not likely to benefit the collective. So think about how well you've designed and defined your program. And then finally, student engagement. And it is an element of fidelity. And we often don't think about it that way because we think about fidelity about what the teacher does. But fidelity of engagement is I can do something that is awesome, right? And if the student is not really attending to that, then there's no benefit for the kid. And then we have to step back and say, what is the nature of the disengagement? Is it that my curriculum design is poor? Is it that my delivery is not a good match, right? Maybe I have a really poor relationship with the student and he just hates me. Or maybe there are other things happening in this kid's life and that what I'm doing right now is not a priority, and I need to respect that. So the sort of student engagement is often used as a rationale for why we have poor data, as opposed to looking at it as an element of fidelity, as something we need to address so that we can get that collective efficacy. And if you find that what you're doing with your EBPs isn't working for most of your students, right, you're getting that less than 80%, that's when we need to step back and say, is there a mismatch, right, between the curriculum and the instruction and what we're doing and student needs? And what we're finding now as a result of COVID is what we thought were kids' needs, because maybe this is what they were pre-COVID or kind of what we thought, are completely different. And the design of our core programming in early 2020 does not match the needs of our students in early 2021. They have greater social emotional needs. They have a lot of learning loss. They're missing a lot of the prerequisites. So when we think about the design of our tier 1, it's got to change. It can't stay the same as last year. It's got to take into account where our kids need to be and where they currently are and what we need to get to them to get to where they need to be. The other thing is that implementation fidelity, and that comes with the consistency that I think most of you talked about, is how well can we get teachers to consistently implement the HLPs or the practices that we talked about. You can make adaptations. It's completely fine to develop or purchase a program and make adaptations, but you want to make sure that those adaptations are consistently implemented across all of the students that it impacts, right? Otherwise, it's inequitable, that some kids are getting high quality instruction and some of them aren't. And so we can't really, at this point in time, we don't have that room to let any kids get behind. So I want to close up because you're probably super exhausted because it's at the end of the day. But I want to just say that when we think about implementation of a school-wide system, particularly MTSS, we know that if we have a system like MTSS in place, that we have the infrastructure and the supports necessary to not only help teachers implement the HLPs successfully, but also for students to benefit from that. So it's not this thing, this program that we do, it's sort of the encompassing infrastructure that allows Tier 1 to get its maximum effect. On the flip side, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg, is that you have to implement your EBPs and using HLPs consistently across your teachers to get that collective benefit as part of Tier 1. Right? So you can't have one before the other. It's kind of like they collectively have to be there. There are some things I just want to share out for next steps. There is a couple of activities that exist in your handout packet I recommend is, thinking about doing a self-evaluation of what you're doing in terms of your Tier 1, evaluating what evidence-based practices exist and looking to see, is there a match between what's expected in terms of evidence-based practices and what you're actually doing. And then also thinking about evaluating that implementation of the HLPs within your current system. Now, I'd like to just offer a ticket out the door. And so what we're going to do is I want you to take about a minute to reflect on, you heard a lot of stuff today, and I apologize if it's too much, but there's a lot of great resources and next steps. And I want you to sort of go back to that FAIR, what is feasible, what is accessible, what is impactful, and what is relevant. And think about the next steps that are listed here and what you will do with the information that you just heard. If you do select other, if you can just write in the chat box what you're going to do, like you're just going to sleep and then let it digest, you can write that as well. But we're going to initiate this final launch and then make sure that you can, be able to access that. Let me Oh, what? Hold on. And I gotta figure out how to go. There we go. So what are your next steps? You're gonna share what you learned, use the Tier 1 self-assessment, maybe assess the HLPs in your school, maybe just play around on all the websites that you saw today. Yeah, so a lot of you are going to share. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing. And I think there's, Dina will talk about how to access the recordings and stuff. But I think that self-evaluation, either through the tool that we shared or the one that's on the WIN website, is a good way to really sort of ground yourself and then just make sure that we're doing something that benefits everyone, but we can feasibly address. Great. All right. So thank y'all for sharing that. And I just want to share some other just resources, and I'm going to pass it over, is that there are a number of other resources available. The National Center on MTSS, that's available with the MTSS. What used to be the RTI Center is now the MTSS Center. There's also the Progress Center, and I just want to share that the Progress Center is seeking schools who are interested in improving progress for students with disabilities. There is an application that is due on January 22nd, but if you are interested in partnering with the center to receive technical assistance around that, they are seeking 16 sites across the country. So just let me know, and I can get you the information. So I want to close there and see if you have any questions or feedbacks. Thank y'all for the thanks in the chat box. I know there's just a lot of stuff going on, and I just want to be mindful, you know, that you probably have a lot of cognitive stress as well, but there are a lot of people here at the State Department, as well as some of the national centers to support you in this work. I'll pass it to you, Tom.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bailey. I'm just monitoring to see if any questions at the moment, and I don't see any. So I'll go ahead and I'll thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. We also appreciate those who participated by learning, making comments, and of course, asking questions.